today with Geoff Kemp, who is the Director for Regional Strategic Programs at the Nixon Center. And we're going to be talking about Gaza and your general take on the situation, who you think this benefits, some predictions on how this will resolve itself. So thank you for being with us.
Not at all.
How would you describe what might have motivated the Israelis in this particular attack?
Well, there was a ceasefire which was in effect for 6 months. The ceasefire came to an end when Hamas started to resume rocket attacks on Israeli towns and villages in southern Israel. And it was clear that if they did this, the Israelis were going to retaliate. I don't think anyone realized they were going to retaliate so fiercely. But you have to understand, this is coming at a really critical time between the American elections, before an Israeli election in February, and at a time when the Palestinian leadership is completely divided, with one group on the West Bank and one group in Gaza. The Israeli motivation was clearly to try to redress some of the damage that was done to their credibility in 2006 when they fought a war with Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon. And the way they've gone about this operation suggests that they have learned a lot of lessons. However, that said, I mean, the longer it goes on, the more this is seen every day on YouTube coming from Al Jazeera feeds out of Gaza, the more difficult it is for the Israelis to sustain the operation since there are so many civilian casualties. So at some point, there's going to have to be a ceasefire. Now, what the Israelis want is for that ceasefire to include a provision which has an enforcement mechanism to prevent Hamas from restocking its rockets and therefore not able to resume the major bombardment of its towns and villages.
And this would be ensured by the international community?
Well, not the UN. I mean, the key player here is Egypt. Egypt and the Europeans probably are the two groups that are going to have to work together if anything is to actually materialize on the ground. It's too early to tell, though, whether the Israelis themselves want a ceasefire at this point in time. Ideally, I think they would like to continue this operation for several more days, if not a week, because they really are destroying a lot of Hamas infrastructure and a lot of Hamas personnel. The problem is, as we saw yesterday, bombs go astray, civilians are killed, and it is terrible publicity. And the asymmetry in casualties between Palestinians and Israelis is very, very high. And we can argue about the whole issue of proportionality, but from a PR standpoint, Israel doesn't have much more than a week, I think.
You've talked about Egypt being one of the guarantors of the peace, should they be able to come to some kind of ceasefire agreement. There has been talk of Israeli activities, in fact, weakening Mubarak's regime. How do you see those two things balancing out?
Oh, I think throughout the Arab world there is a great deal of anger at Arab moderate governments because, by and large, they hate what Hamas is doing. They support Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah, yet the people in the street, the ordinary Arabs or Muslims throughout the entire region are watching the endless loops on Al Jazeera of very unpleasant pictures. So there's a lot of anger, and there's not much the regimes can do about it. They're going to have to roll with this one. But I don't think any regime is threatened by this. I really don't.
And some people have also made the argument that in a similar vein that Israel's attack has really been aimed in many ways at Iran, not just at Hamas. How do you read that?
Well, I think it's very interesting that the Iranians have been high on rhetoric. I mean, the support in Iran for Hamas there always has been. But they've not done anything foolish so far. And the test case will be in Lebanon. Today there was a report that 3 rockets had been fired from northern Lebanon into Israel, but it's believed these rockets came from Palestinian groups, not from Hezbollah. I would be very surprised if Hezbollah opens a second front against Israel, because Israel will retaliate brutally, and Lebanon will suffer, and the Lebanese are also facing an election in the coming months. I don't think Iran wants to stir this pot at this point in time, but they like being seen as the one country whose leaders are speaking out more strongly in favor of Hamas than their Arab brethren.
Now, I think what we have not been hearing all that much about is the Obama team's reaction to this. Can you explain why that might be, and also what your interpretation is of their position?
First, the team's not in place. I mean, the only formal name that has been put forward is Hillary Clinton, and she hasn't even been confirmed. So until there's more clarity as to who's going to be on her team, I think it would be very premature for them to talk, particularly at this delicate time. I think on the issue of the economy, Obama had no option but to go ahead and make the statements he's made about deficit inevitability and mandatory sort of printing of money. In the case of foreign policy, I mean, he should not be speaking out at this point in time beyond the sort of general statements that he's already made.
Can you read anything from the statements that he has made?
They, of course, say they are not going to do what Bush did, let this conflict fester for years and years, and then try in the last 12 months to pull something out of the hat, which is what essentially happened. It was not until Condoleezza Rice assembled the Annapolis conference last year that really things, it was November 2007, that things really began to pick up steam, and then nothing has really happened. They don't want to do that. They are going to be hands-on, they're going to be engaged. The problem is, it comes at a time when the United States faces $1 trillion deficit, a military that is exhausted, 2 wars that are unfinished elsewhere, a looming problem with Iran's nuclear program. There are just limits to how much more we can do. And therefore, I think, knowing some of the characters who've been mentioned as working for Hillary Clinton, they're going to be very, very bullish on more cooperation with the Europeans and probably trying to get some better understanding of Russia, trying to get the Russians to back off and be more supportive on the overall Middle East agenda, including Iran. But of course, that's going to mean giving the Russians something they want. And therefore, I expect a much more vigorous debate than we've seen to date on the wisdom of extending American guarantees into East Europe, to Ukraine, or to Georgia, for instance, because we can't do everything. We're in a, what I would call an East of Suez situation, where we have to cut our cloth to meet our budgets.
Well, thank you very much for all of your wise counsel.
Thank you.